Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the absolute tragedy, and frankly, the baffling mystery of Air India Flight 171. We're looking at a totally routine flight that out of nowhere morphed into a catastrophe in literally seconds. And what's wild is that the data we have seems to completely defy the laws of physics. Let's look at the 3D reconstruction and the preliminary report to figure out what actually happened.
Why did you turn it off? I didn't do it. This chilling exchange, caught on the cockpit voice recorder right before impact, sits at the very core of our investigation today. It's a brief, highly confusing back and forth between Captain Sumit Sabharwal and First Officer Clive Kunda, and it points to one singular, fatal action that doomed their 787 Dreamliner before it even really got off the ground.
Here's how we're going to break down the investigation file. First, the fateful takeoff. Second, the anatomy of the crash. Third, a physics-defying discrepancy in the data. Fourth, 4 theories on the engine cutoff. And finally, the black box mystery.
All right, Section 1, the fateful takeoff, setting the physical stakes. So this Boeing 787 was absolutely packed. It had 230 passengers, 12 crew members, and 54,000 kilos of fuel loaded up for the long haul to London. All in all, this jet weighed in at a massive 200 tons. Now that is incredibly heavy. It was pushing right up against its operational limits, but as anyone who flies long haul knows, it was still entirely within the safe, normal capabilities of the aircraft.
But you have to add intense heat into the mix. It was a scorching 36 degrees Celsius in Ahmedabad that day, which meant the density altitude was really high. Basically, hotter air means less lift for the wings and less oxygen for the engines to breathe. So for an already heavy jet, that drastically increases the speed you need to safely take off.
Because you combine that immense weight with that sweltering heat, the pilots needed the entire 3,500-meter length of runway 23 to get airborne. I mean, they literally needed every single meter of that concrete to build up enough momentum. And this is crucial, because just beyond the end of that runway lay the airport perimeter wall, and right past that, the densely populated neighborhood of Meghani Nagar.
Now, rolling down the runway, everything went totally by the book. They hit all their crucial speed milestones flawlessly. They hit V1, the point of no return, at 153 knots. Then VR, rotation speed, at 155 knots with the nose lifting perfectly, and the weight-on-wheel sensor seamlessly transitioned the plane in air mode without a hitch. It was a textbook takeoff until it wasn't.
Moving to Section 2, Anatomy of the Crash, a 2.5-second catastrophe.
Literally, just after crossing that perimeter wall, things went horribly wrong. The plane started losing altitude and drifting to the left. At 13:39 and 9 seconds, the aircraft, which is flying extremely low at this point, clips some trees and an incinerator chimney. And the heartbreaking part is that the flight data shows the plane was pitched up at an 8-degree angle. The pilots were desperately pulling back on the yokes, doing everything they could to clear the buildings right in front of them. But you know, a 200-ton aircraft without power, it's basically a falling brake. In just 2.5 seconds, it plowed into 3 separate buildings, ripping off the landing gear, the wings, and the tail, before all that fuel, 54,000 kilos of it, ignited in a massive explosion.
Section 3. The physics-defying discrepancy. The data anomaly.
Here is where things get really weird. The official preliminary report claims the plane hit a maximum speed of 180 knots before the fuel cutoff switches were thrown. But a meticulously detailed 3D simulation reveals an impossible contradiction. The simulation data shows the plane actually continued to accelerate, reaching 196 knots for 5 full seconds after the engines were supposedly shut off. So what does this all mean? How does a 200-ton aircraft continue to accelerate and climb to 230 feet when its power source is completely dead? If the official reports are getting the basic physics wrong, we've got a major problem on our hands.
Now you might be thinking, well, what about residual thrust? But basic jet engine physics totally rules that out. When you cut the fuel, thrust collapses almost instantly. We're talking high-pressure gases flushing out of the system in less than a second. Residual thrust absolutely cannot explain a 5-second, 16-knot acceleration. It leaves a glaring, massive gap in the official timeline.
Which brings us to Section 4, 4-engine cutoff theories, process of elimination.
So why on earth were those fuel switches moved in the first place? We basically have 4 possibilities to look at. Theory 4, a phantom system failure where the switches never actually moved. Theory 3, the aircraft's automated software tripped them. Theory 2, accidental human clumsiness. Or Theory 1, and this is the most chilling, intentional manual movement. Let's dig into the black box evidence and systematically dismantle these.
Right off the bat, Theory 4 is completely debunked. The 787 has this dedicated RDC data line that records the direct physical, mechanical position of the switch to the black box, and it recorded those switches physically moving to the cutoff position. So it wasn't a false sensor reading or a ghost of the machine, they actually moved.
Okay, so what about Theory 3? Could a safety software called TCMA have automatically cut the engines? Well, that falls apart completely for two big reasons. First, TCMA doesn't physically move the switches in the cockpit. It closes a valve deep inside the engine itself. Second, if TCMA does trigger, it's a permanent shutdown for that flight. It strictly requires maintenance crews on the ground to reset it, meaning you absolutely cannot restart those engines midair. But the flight data clearly shows the engines were successfully restarted later in the flight. So scratch that, it couldn't have been the software.
So could it have been a complete accident? Theory 2 is highly improbable, mostly because of the aircraft's brilliant ergonomic design. These switches have 3 robust mechanical safeguards built right in. First, they're spring-loaded, so you have to actively pinch and pull them up. Second, they sit behind raised physical guards to block a rogue hand swipe. And third, they have mechanical stops at the base to prevent your hand from slipping. Making this mistake on just one switch is incredibly hard, but accidentally bumping both of them into the cutoff position within exactly 1 second of each other? Literally, virtually impossible.
And that leaves us with Theory 1. By simple process of elimination, we're left with a deeply chilling reality. Intentional activation is the only mechanically viable explanation that isn't contradicted by the aircraft's design. Someone in that cockpit actively pinched, lifted, and pulled those 2 switches into the cutoff position during the absolute most critical phase of the flight.
Finally, Section 5. The Black Box Mystery. Unanswered questions.
Let's look at the recovery effort, because it brings up a highly concerning anomaly regarding aviation safety hardware. This aircraft has 2 black boxes, but the rear flight recorder and the emergency locator transmitter, or ELT, were completely destroyed by thermal damage. Think about that for a second. These devices are literally engineered to survive massive, high-speed impacts and intense fires, yet they completely failed in a relatively low-speed, low-altitude crash. To make matters worse, India's Accident Investigation Bureau lacked a basic golden chassis needed to read the module that actually did survive. Despite having dozens of these planes flying overhead every single day, they had to hit pause on the investigation just to import a standard 787 component from the US.
This leaves us with some glaring, fundamental mysteries. What physical force caused a 200-ton aircraft to accelerate for 5 full seconds without any engines? And why did crash-proof safety hardware fail to survive a low-speed impact? Until the final report can definitively answer these physics-defying questions, the true story of Air India 171 isn't just incomplete. It points to the possibility of unknown physical flaws in the aircraft itself, or catastrophic gaps in how we investigate them. So what forces were truly at play in those final seconds? And more importantly, are they still flying with us today?